There is a specific moment when you cease to be simply a player and begin to be a narrative. You can perceive that this occurs not through dramatic gesture, but through conversations that define how your legacy will be understood. And on that Thursday afternoon, Steph Curry was in one of those moments. Television studio in New York, bright lights, live cameras, hundreds of millions of people watching simultaneously. Curry had been invited for a conversation about legacy, about leadership, about what it means to redefine a position in basketball. It seemed like a simple conversation, but there was tension in the air. Because you can perceive when something has been planned to be more than conversation, when there is hidden agenda. The presenter, a man in his 50-somethings, began politely. Questions about career, questions about championships, questions about what it means to be a leader in your era. Curry responded with articulated honesty. He had studied how to be interviewed. He had learned to balance humility with confidence. He had learned to honor the past while building the future. "You know," said Curry, and there was sincerity in his voice, "when I grew up, basketball was defined in a certain way. Fixed point, brutal personal defense, championships through attrition. My job was not to say that way was wrong. My job was to expand what was possible, to show that you could win through rapid movement, three-point shooting, intelligence in system. You can perceive when someone is speaking genuine truth, when it is not prepared narrative, but lived understanding." The presenter nodded. He seemed to be appreciating the response. But then something changed. It changed subtly, through a small question that seemed innocent. "Steph, have you ever thought about how it would be to compare your career with Michael Jordan's?" And it is impossible not to feel when a question changes in tone, when it ceases to be curiosity and becomes objective. Curry breathed. He knew this game. He knew the dynamic. He knew that Jordan was always the standard against which all others were measured. "Well," Curry began carefully, "Michael played in a different context, different system. He was the greatest player of his era. I try to be the best of my era." It is a perfect response. It is a response that honors both. It is a response that says, different times, different excellences. But the presenter was not satisfied to leave it. "But if you had to put them side by side, honestly, who do you think would be better?" And you can perceive when someone is refusing to let you be enough as you are, when they insist on hierarchizing. Curry tried again. "I do not think it works that way. Michael won 6 championships in an era where everybody defended personally. I won in an era where basketball is different. I cannot—" "Right, right," interrupted the presenter, and there was a quality to his tone suggesting that he had the answer. "But statistically, have you ever considered that Michael was simply better? And it is impossible not to recognize when you are being manipulated, when conversation ceased to be a conversation and became an interrogation." "No," responded Curry, and there was patience in his voice. "Because better implies a hierarchy that does not exist. Michael was extraordinary in his time. I try to be extraordinary in mine. This is not comparable." The presenter smiled. That kind of smile that is a weapon. A smile that communicates, "You are being defensive." "Look," said the presenter, "and you can perceive when someone is beginning a movement of attack. What intrigues me is that you frequently talk about redefining the position. But the truth is that you were lucky." Lucky. A word that implied that Curry had done nothing real, that everything was circumstance. "Lucky in what?" asked Curry, and you can hear the first signs of frustration. Well, you grew up in the era of the three-pointer. It was when the entire basketball system changed to value the three-point shot. If you had played in the 1990s with Jordan's defensive rules, you would not be the same player. It is an argument that Curry had heard hundreds of times. It is an argument that is fundamentally dishonest, because it implies that context makes excellence irrelevant. "Context always matters," responded Curry, and there was the beginning of anger in his voice. But context does not invalidate excellence. Michael played better defense because it was an era when personal defense was strategy. I play basketball as it was played in my time. Both of us are excellent in our contexts. You can perceive when someone is trying to be fair, while another refuses to be fair. The imbalance is palpable. And the presenter knew this. The presenter knew that he had Curry in a position of seeming defensive, when in fact Curry was being attacked. "But specifically," continued the presenter, "and there was a quality of a dog not letting go of a bone. Defense. Michael was defensive MVP. Michael could defend you physically in your era. Could you defend him in his? It is a question that is a trap, because the answer is no, contexts are different. But the presenter can use this to say, see, you yourself admit that he was better defensively. Curry understood this, understood that he was in an arena of rhetoric where truth did not matter, only narrative. Personal defense in the 1990s was different from defense in the modern system, said Curry. I played defense in my system, which is a different system. I cannot be compared on a scale of personal defense because the game changed. So is it to say that you would not be able to defend Michael? Asked the presenter. And there is a quality to the question that is almost innocent. But it is not innocent. And it is at that moment that you can perceive when someone has finally reached their limit. When patience runs out. Curry breathed deeply. And when he spoke, there was a tremor in his voice that had not been there before. Not anger, but pain. You know what is frustrating, said Curry, and you can perceive complete authenticity in the moment. My job was never to be Michael Jordan. My job was to be Steph Curry. My job was to expand what a point guard could do. And apparently, this is not enough. Apparently, my legacy only matters if I can be compared to someone from a completely different era and lose that comparison. Apparently, excellence is not recognized unless it is excellence in the form of Michael Jordan. And this is fundamentally unfair. You can perceive when truth is spoken with genuine emotion. When it is not narrative, it is wound. The studio became quiet, because there is a silence that comes when someone fulfills their own misery. The presenter tried to recover. I am not saying that you are not excellent. I am just saying that you are saying that my legacy only matters in the context of being compared to someone and found inadequate, interrupted Curry. You are saying that basketball simply evolved. This does not mean that new players can be recognized as extraordinary on their own terms. And it is impossible not to recognize when Curry touched on something true. When he named the dynamic that the entire world perceives, but does not verbalize. Because this is the truth. There is a narrative that says that the legacy of the new is only valid if it manages to be better than the legacy of the old. If it manages to defeat the past. But Curry was saying, no, my legacy is valid because I redefined, because I expanded, because I showed things that had never been seen before. I do not need to be better than Michael to be extraordinary. I only need to be extraordinary in my context. The presenter was visibly uncomfortable. Because his narrative had been dismantled, because truth had entered into a space that had been designated for rhetoric. "Well," said the presenter, trying to recover ground, "the truth is that you have 4 championships against 6. This is not opinion. This is fact. And you can perceive when someone uses fact as a weapon, when he converts a number into hierarchy." Curry, at that moment, understood that he had lost the rhetorical war. Because on television, silence is defeat. And Curry had chosen silence. He breathed. And when he spoke again, there was something that had changed in his voice. Not anger, but resignation. "I have my own legacy," said Curry, and you can hear the weight of all the comparisons he had endured in his voice. "You do not need to diminish mine to respect Michael's. Both can be valid. Both can be extraordinary, can coexist." But the words sounded desperate. They sounded like a man who had said this many times before, like a man who was tired of not being heard. The presenter smiled. That smile of victory. Because on television, whoever has the last words appears to have won, regardless of truth. "Well, this is all the time we have today," said the presenter, as if the gesture of closure was the conclusion of a point. "Thank you, Steph, for being with us." Curry nodded. He stood up. He extended his hand. And when he did, you can perceive a man who had been diminished. Not because he had lost a debate, but because the world had seen and had agreed with the diminishment. Because cameras had captured everything. And in a world of social networks, the narrative was already being constructed. Curry cannot defend himself against comparison with Jordan. And then, in that studio in New York, the interview ended. But somewhere else, someone had been watching. And something extraordinary was about to happen. And so, on that Thursday afternoon, Steph Curry had been diminished in front of the world. He had been confronted with a narrative that refused to recognize that multiple forms of excellence could coexist. He had been forced to defend his own greatness against someone who had decided that his greatness was only valid if it was inferior to another's greatness. And the world had seen, and the world had begun to agree. Because this is the power of television. Truth does not matter if the narrative is convincing. And the narrative had been very convincing. But in Chicago, in the home of someone who had redefined basketball decades ago, something extraordinary was happening. Because not everyone who matters is in the studio. Sometimes, the one who matters most is watching from afar. Michael Jordan rarely watches interviews about himself. Not because he is not interested, but because there is a quality in not being present to validate or reject narratives. But on that Thursday afternoon, something had drawn him to the television. Perhaps it was a warning from a friend. Perhaps it was simple coincidence of being home when the broadcast began. What matters is that Michael Jordan was watching. And you can perceive when someone who redefined a sport is really observing, when their attention is completely focused on what is happening on the screen. Jordan began to watch like anyone else, observing Curry answer questions. Observing Curry with elegance try to balance humility with confidence. "The kid plays well," Jordan had said to himself, because it was true. Jordan had always recognized excellence when he saw it. There was no need to diminish someone who had achieved greatness. But as the interview progressed, something changed in Jordan. Because you can perceive when the dynamic changes from conversation to confrontation. When questions cease to be curiosity and become weapons. Jordan saw the presenter begin to push Curry toward comparison. Saw the rhetorical game begin. saw the small manipulations that those not trained in media cannot see. And as he watched, indignation began to grow in Jordan. Not with Curry, because Curry was doing nothing wrong. Curry was being attacked by someone who should have been neutral. Curry was being diminished by someone whose platform allowed him to do this without consequences. The indignation grew in Jordan because he had seen this before, had seen narrative be constructed, had seen basketball be used not as a sport but as an arena for ego, had seen fact be converted into a weapon of hierarchization. And now it was happening to Curry. "This is not fair," said Jordan aloud to his empty house. And you can perceive when someone who has spent a lifetime being competitive understands that this is not competition. This is predation. Jordan stood up. He began to walk. Because there is a quality of energy in observing injustice that cannot be ignored. He thought about it as he walked, thought about Curry, thought about what Curry had done with basketball, thought about how Curry had expanded possibility in a way that he himself, Jordan, never could. And this was a fundamental truth that many people did not understand. Michael Jordan was not a versatile player in the sense of being able to do everything. Michael Jordan was a perfect player in his context, but his context had its limits. If you placed Michael Jordan in the modern basketball system, with the three-pointer being a strategic weapon, with the pace being accelerated, with defense being different, he would still be great. But he would not be Michael Jordan in his context. It would be a different version, perhaps smaller, of himself. Curry, however, had been born in an era where the three-pointer was a weapon, had grown up in a system where he could thrive. And in that era, he had achieved an excellence that was completely his own. And this was what Jordan had always understood but had never publicly verbalized. Admiration for Curry. Because what Curry did was not competition with what Jordan had done. It was an evolution of something that Jordan had initiated. It was the next chapter in a story that Jordan had helped write. "He expanded the game," said Jordan to himself, stopping his walk. "He did exactly what I did in my era, redefined what was possible." And it was true. When Jordan had arrived in the NBA, defense was brutal. Basketball was about brute force disguised as technique. And Jordan had shown that you could win through skill, through dedication, through complete domination. Curry, in a different way, had shown that you could win through rapid movement, through precise long-distance shooting, through an intelligent system. They were different forms of excellence, but both were genuinely extraordinary. And Jordan had studied Curry with a meticulous care that few knew about, had watched games, had analyzed systems, had understood the evolution, not publicly, but privately. In close circles, Jordan had admitted admiration, had told friends, "This kid is special, not in my way, but special." But the world did not know this, because there was a dynamic in being the GOAT. There was expectation. There was a narrative that suggested that you could only be better if all other legacies were smaller. So, Jordan had kept admiration private, had kept recognition within small circles. But now, watching Curry be diminished in real time, something in Jordan broke. Because there is a limit to how long someone who understands truth can remain silent when a lie is being constructed. And this was the lie, that Curry was smaller because he played in a different context. This was the distortion, that Curry's excellence was the luck of the era. This was the rejection of evolution by someone who did not want to understand that the world had evolved beyond him. And Jordan understood that he needed to speak. Not because Curry needed him. Curry was a strong player. Curry could take care of himself. But because the world needed to hear from Michael Jordan that multiple forms of excellence could coexist, because it was a message that only the GOAT could communicate with authority that would be heard. "I need to go there," said Jordan aloud, "and you can perceive when someone makes a decision that changes everything." He picked up his phone, called the producer, said, "Am I at that interview in New York?" He was not. But the producer immediately understood what Jordan was asking. Understood that Michael Jordan wanted to be there, wanted to make his entrance. And when Michael Jordan wants something in basketball, the entire world perceives it. Within hours, arrangements were made. Jordan was on the plane. Jordan was in the city. Jordan was backstage at the studio. But nobody knew. Because this needed to be a surprise. Because the moment needed to be genuine, not choreographed. And as Jordan waited, he thought about what he would say. Because you can perceive when someone is about to do something that will change the narrative completely. When is about to use his own voice to validate another. "He deserves to be recognized," said Jordan to himself. "Not as better than me, not as less than me, but as extraordinary in his own era. And the world needs to hear this coming from me." And you can perceive when someone understands the true meaning of legacy. It is not protection against the recognition of another. It is not a hierarchy that you establish to validate yourself. It is the recognition that your own greatness is secure enough to validate different greatness. And so, in a distant studio, the presenter believed that he had won the debate, had diminished Curry through rhetoric, had convinced the world that Curry's excellence was smaller because it was excellence in a different context, had protected the narrative of one era against the threat of a new era. But what the presenter did not know was that someone who really understood the game was backstage. Someone who had dedicated a life to understanding excellence. Someone whose voice, when he spoke, could not be ignored. Because when Michael Jordan speaks, the entire world listens, and what he had to say would change everything. The interview had ended. Curry had left the studio with the weight of diminishment on his shoulders. The presenter had returned to his chair with the satisfaction of someone who believes they have won a debate. Producers were cleaning the studio, preparing for the next segment. And then the doors opened. Not dramatically, but with authority. Because when Michael Jordan enters a space, the space understands it. People feel it. You can perceive when a presence is so monumentally important that it does not need an introduction. The producers turned. The technicians turned. The presenter turned. "Michael Jordan," said a producer, confused and shocked simultaneously. You were not scheduled." But Jordan did not respond to the producer. His eyes were on the presenter. And you can perceive when someone who has spent a life controlling narrative is confronted by a narrative they cannot control. The presenter became pale. "Michael," began the presenter, trying to recover. "What an honor. We did not know that you—" "I heard what you were saying," interrupted Jordan, and you can hear in his voice a quality that does not admit objection. "I heard what you said to Curry, and I need to be clear with you and with the world. You were wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Because when Michael Jordan says that someone was wrong, the world listens. Because there is an authority in his voice that comes from decades of dominance. "Steph Curry is not Michael Jordan," continued Jordan, and there was a significant pause. "Steph Curry is extraordinary. Period. This should be enough." You can perceive when truth is spoken with such clarity that nobody can distort it, when simple facts are communicated without qualification. "You did something today that I have always hated," said Jordan, and now his voice had a quality of education, of someone teaching an important lesson. You used comparison as a weapon of delegitimization. If you had to play my game, is a way of saying, my excellence is the only valid one. Jordan walked closer to the presenter, not threateningly, but with a presence that was undeniable. But the world does not work that way, continued Jordan. The world evolves. Basketball evolves. Steph Curry is a product of that evolution, and he is extraordinary in it. The presenter tried to speak. Michael, I was not trying to— You were trying to protect a narrative, interrupted Jordan. You were trying to suggest that the legacy of one era only matters if all the legacies that follow are smaller. This is not strength. This is insecurity. And you can perceive when someone is naming a dynamic that the world perceives but does not verbalize, when a fundamental truth about how power functions is communicated. I studied Steph Curry, said Jordan, and now there was something profound in his voice. Complete honesty. I studied his games. I understood that he had done something that I never could have done. I understood that he expanded what was possible in basketball in a way that was genuinely his own. This does not make me smaller. This makes him extraordinary. Because this is what excellence means: redefining possibility in your context. Jordan turned to Curry, who had returned to the studio after hearing the commotion. And you can perceive genuine emotion in his face. Unexpected recognition. Unexpected validation. Steph, said Jordan directly, and there was a quality in his voice of a mentor, of someone who had understood the journey. You do not need to defend yourself. Your legacy is safe. Because you did exactly what I did in my era. Redefined how the game was played. You showed the world that a point guard could be a scorer. You expanded possibility. This is excellence. Curry was visibly moved. Because there is weight in being validated by an idol. There is weight in having your work recognized not as a smaller version of something earlier, but as genuinely your own excellence. And to be honest, continued Jordan, and now there was something vulnerable in his voice, I have always admired how you did this. This does not diminish what I did. It simply situates both of us in the context of the evolution of basketball. It makes the narrative more interesting, not less. Jordan turned again to the presenter. And you can perceive when someone who has spent a lifetime controlling an arena is being confronted by a truth that cannot be refuted. Do you know why this irritated me? Asked Jordan, and it was a rhetorical question that was education. Because I saw a young and talented person be diminished by someone whose platform allows him to do this without consequences. I saw a narrative be constructed not on facts, but on ego. I saw possibility be rejected because it was a threat to an established narrative. And this has always irritated me. Because basketball is not about protecting the legacy of one generation against another. It is about understanding that each generation contributes to a continuing journey of excellence. The presenter was in complete silence. Because how do you refute Michael Jordan? How do you argue against the GOAT recognizing the excellence of another? So, I will say this clearly, for the record, said Jordan, and you can perceive when someone is creating a moment that will be remembered. Michael Jordan thinks Steph Curry is extraordinary. Michael Jordan thinks that what Curry did with basketball is of immense value. Michael Jordan thinks that multiple forms of excellence can coexist without one being smaller than another. Jordan extended his hand to Curry, and when they made contact, it was a moment that was broadcasted to the world. It was a moment that confirmed this was not competition. It was recognition. It was validation. "Congratulations on your legacy," said Jordan to Curry. "Continue expanding the game, because this is what leaders do. And you can perceive when a historic moment is occurring in real time. When cameras are capturing something that will be repeated infinite times, that will be studied by future generations as an example of a great one recognizing another as equally great." The entire studio was in silence. But it was a different silence than that previous silence. It was not a silence of defeat. It was a silence of truth being recognized. It was a silence of the world understanding that the narrative had changed fundamentally. "This is all I have to say," said Jordan, and walked toward the door. And as he left, you can perceive that he left behind something that could not be reversed. Left behind a transformed narrative. Left behind a presenter without an answer. Left behind Curry with a validation that no money, no prize could buy. And so, in that studio in New York, something extraordinary had happened. Not because Curry won the debate, but because Michael Jordan understood something fundamental. True legacy is not protection against the recognition of another. True legacy is secure enough to validate another. True legacy is recognizing that your own success is so secure that you can, without fear, say, "That other person is also extraordinary." And when the GOAT does this, when the greatest player of all time looks at the camera and says, "I am watching excellence different from mine, but equally extraordinary," the narrative does not just change, the world changes. Because there is truth in his words that transcends basketball. There is truth about what it means to be truly great. Hours after Michael Jordan left the IEU studio, the clip had already become viral. It was not news, it was a phenomenon. Because you can perceive when the entire world is watching something simultaneously. When a narrative is being reconstructed in real time. The title of the clip was not "Curry Defends Himself Against Presenter." The title was "Michael Jordan Recognizes Steph Curry as Extraordinary." Because that was the real point. That was the moment that mattered. Social media exploded. Not with debate, but with recognition. People were reposting not to argue, but to share a truth that had been communicated. Jordan had said, "Multiple forms of excellence can coexist," and the world was receiving that message. In the studio, after Jordan left, there was a moment of absolute silence that remained for complete seconds. Then, producers began to move. Assistants began to whisper. Cameras continued recording because the moment had not ended. Curry, when he managed to move, approached the presenter. And you can perceive when someone is processing something that has changed their life completely. The weight of being validated by an idol is not something you process quickly. The presenter was practically in a state of shock. Because what could he say? How does someone refute Michael Jordan validating another? There was no answer. There was only silence. "Thank you," was all Curry could say. Simple words that carried the weight of decades. This means more than you understand. You can perceive when someone is genuinely moved, when the barrier of professionalism falls and only humanity remains. "Because I grew up watching Michael," continued Curry, and you can hear a tremor in his voice. "I understood that excellence was Michael. And everything I did knowing that I would never be better than Michael. But I never thought about being better. I thought about being different. I thought about expanding possibility. And to hear you say that this matters, that this is excellence, this changes everything. And it is impossible not to feel the weight of genuine validation being communicated. Within hours, The clip was on billions of devices, not just in sports, but on social networks, on news channels, on conversations at dinner tables around the world. But more important than the clip was the narrative that had changed. Before, Curry is good, but he is not Jordan. After, Curry redefined basketball in a way that Jordan never could, and this is extraordinary. Before, excellence is singular and hierarchical. After, excellence can be multiple and coexistent. You can perceive when a narrative changes fundamentally, when something that was established is replaced by something new. Curry, in a much later interview, reflected on the moment. You know, every athlete wants to be recognized for their work, wants their legacy to be respected. But there is a dynamic where you are constantly measured against the one who came before. And it is exhausting, because you spend your whole life hearing, "You are not like Michael. Michael would do it differently. Michael was better defensively." And you understand this. You recognize that Michael was extraordinary, but you also understand that you are trying to be yourself, that you are trying to expand what is possible in your context. And when Michael looked at the camera and said, "Curry is extraordinary, period," when he said this with authority that could not be questioned, something changed in me, because suddenly it was allowed to be Curry. It was allowed to have expanded basketball in a way that was genuinely mine. It was allowed to be extraordinary in my own right, not as a diminished version of something that came before. This is the power of genuine validation. This is the power of someone who understands excellence, recognizing different excellence. Months later, Jordan was asked why he had interrupted the interview. His answer was revealing. "Because I was tired. I was tired of a narrative that suggested that my legacy only mattered if all the other legacies that followed were smaller. I was tired of seeing different excellence be rejected because it was a threat to an established narrative. Basketball evolved. I was part of that evolution in my time. Curry is part of the evolution in his time. Understanding this does not diminish what I did. It simply situates both of us in the greater context of the sport's history. Beyond that, I saw in Curry something that I saw in myself when I was young, a genuine desire to expand possibility, to show the world things never seen before, to redefine not just a position, but the entire game. This deserved to be recognized, not diminished by an unfair comparison with a different era. Because when you truly understand the game, you understand that evolution is not a threat. Evolution is a continuation. It is the next chapter in a story you helped write. And to be part of that story, even if only through recognition, is an extraordinary honor. And so, the legacy of both Jordan and Curry was reframed not as competition, but as evolution. Not as better versus worse, but as different but equally extraordinary. This changed how both would be remembered, not as rivals, but as guardians of different eras of the same continuing excellence. Young players who were growing up understood something new. You do not need to be like the one who came before to be extraordinary. You just need to be genuinely excellent in your own context. And this freed generations of players from the weight of being constantly measured against a standard that was not theirs. Beyond basketball, the narrative had changed something more fundamental. It had introduced the idea that multiple forms of excellence could coexist without competition. This reverberates in education. It reverberates in business. It reverberates in the arts. Because there is a universal tendency to try to hierarchize, to try to say, my form of excellence is the only valid one. And what Jordan had done was name this and refuse it, had told the world, No, excellence can have multiple faces. Years later, a young basketball player was being raised with a different narrative, was being taught that Michael Jordan was extraordinary in his context. Steph Curry was extraordinary in his context. Both expanded the game in fundamentally different ways. Both deserve absolute respect. There is no better. There is only extraordinary in different eras. And because the young person was raised with this understanding, when he became a player, he did not compete with the past. He built the future. Did not try to be Jordan. Did not try to be Curry. Tried to be himself. Tried to expand possibility in a way that was genuinely his own. And this was the true legacy that Jordan and Curry together had created. A narrative where each generation is authorized to be genuinely excellent in their own terms. And so is how true legacy is built. Not through protection against the recognition of another, but through genuine validation of different excellence. Michael Jordan did not interrupt that interview because Curry needed him. Curry was a strong player. Curry could take care of himself. But the world needed to hear from the GOAT that multiple forms of greatness can coexist. Because there is power in someone who redefined a sport, recognizing that the sport had evolved beyond him. And instead of resentment, there is admiration. Instead of hierarchy, there is mutual recognition. This is true leadership. This is true legacy. It is not about being better. It is about being part of a continuing journey of excellence that transcends any individual. It is about recognizing that the world evolves, that possibility expands, that excellence takes new forms while earlier ones are still valid. And when you understand this, you understand that your own legacy is safe. Safe not because protected against the future, but because it is part of a continuing narrative that will always be honored as it contributes to the chapters that come. Michael Jordan understood this when he said, "Steph Curry is extraordinary, period." Those words, simple and direct, reframed not just Curry's legacy. They reframed the entire concept of how excellence is measured and honored. Because when the GOAT recognizes the future while honoring the past, he does something that very few can achieve. Transforms the world not through force, but through truth. And the truth is that excellence is vast enough for everyone. That legacy is secure enough to validate different legacy. That the world is better when it recognizes that multiple forms of greatness can shine simultaneously. This is legacy reframed. This is transcendence of ego. This is what it means to be truly great.